I'm Douglas Mason, CEO of Naturally Splendid, symbol NSP on the TSX Venture Exchange. Naturally Splendid is a biotechnology and consumer products company focused on the global cannabis and health markets. Naturally Splendid is expanding distribution in this rapidly growing market with products currently in Canada, the USA, South Korea, Germany, and Australia. To view our comprehensive company presentation and for more information, please visit our website at naturallysplendid.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is home ownership consultant Ross Kay from thewealthyhomeowner.ca. Welcome back to the show, Ross.
And thanks for having me back, Jim.
Ross, Finance Minister Carol James of BC's got a big smile on her face, bragging about how her government policies, taxation, and so on have driven down home prices by hundreds of millions of dollars. And you cited Canadian homeowners have lost $600 billion in wealth over the last 2 years. Should the finance minister be bragging about this?
I don't know. I think it's kind of the most insulting thing that any politician could ever say. They're sitting there and they are basically laughing at families who have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the Canadian case, where over $600 billion has been lost since the interest rate bottomed in November of 2017. 2016. We are looking at the largest net wealth decrease in this country that has ever taken place, Jim. And I can understand the people who don't own homes right now applauding that housing prices are coming down. But you have to remember, the vast majority of Canadian families actually do own a home. I mean, our home ownership rate's around 70%, 73%, somewhere in that range. Now, I understand in Vancouver it's lower because housing prices are higher and because the amount of rentals that goes on there. But the rest of the nation, the vast majority of the nation, this is a loss of net wealth. I know a lot of the naysayers out there will be saying, well, Ross, this is only on paper. It's not real. Well, the second you go into a bank and want to borrow money, it's real. The second that someone wants to buy a car, it's real. The second that someone wants to put their child in post-secondary, it's real. The second someone's sick in a family home and they need to get money out to survive while they're working their way through this sickness or illness, it's real. This is real wealth. This is as much real wealth as it's in the stock market. If you own shares of Apple today and they're worth $150, that you can cash those tomorrow for $150. This is real wealth. It isn't just paper wealth. It is real. If you can take your home ownership contract, the contract in your house, and you can walk into a bank and you can finance based on that number, it's real. So when I hear politicians basically bragging about driving the price of housing down, you know, for me, it's a double-edged sword. First of all, I know housing prices are going to drop anyways. Okay? So I know that in the housing market, housing prices were unsustainable. They had to fall. There was nothing that was going to take place that would keep prices where they were. The property ladder creates the house price illusion, which allows a housing bubble to form, which means it's going to have to pop. So I understand probably more than most what's going to happen with the housing market. Regardless, I wouldn't be laughing at people or lauding a $600 billion hit to the net wealth of the nation. And that's only a preliminary calculation, Jim. In our internal numbers, the numbers that we use, because we use these numbers to figure out what's going to happen with the housing market going forward. The loss is substantially more than that. I believe right now we're approaching $1 trillion in lost net wealth from this housing correction. Now everybody says, Ross, how do you come up with these numbers? Okay, look folks, there are over 15 million homes in Canada. I understand some of those are rental housing stock. The average selling price, the average purchase price paid for a home has dropped $40,000 nationally. Okay, $40,000 nationally. So you times 40 times 15, and you come up with your 600. That is a real number. And it's really easy for us to show $1 trillion loss. Now, imagine that happening in the stock market, Jim. Imagine all of the people that House Street interviews, the financial experts, stockbrokers, analysts, financial advisors. Imagine those people sitting here today talking about a $1 trillion loss in the stock market. We would be hearing calls that the government has to step in and save corporations. Yet we're seeing these losses today, and it's being bragged about. Now again, I am an advocate for lower housing prices. I understand that the housing market is going to correct. That still doesn't mean that I'm going to sit here laughing at people who have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I understand that there are people, boomers, people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, who bought a single detached home in Vancouver or downtown Toronto 40 years ago. And that house now is worth $1.5 million. It may have been worth $2 million. In some cases, if it was lucky enough, they might have hit the jackpot. It could have been a $3 million home. And that money now has evaporated. I mean, what Carol James is laughing at, Jim. She's laughing at this. Think about it. You have a tax that comes in at $3 million. The government is collecting an additional tax if your home is worth over $3 million. Well, how many houses do you think in the last 3 years, since 2016, has Vancouver lost out of the $3 million tax bracket? And those people are all wealthy owners. A large percentage of them were recent buyers of homes that were foreign buyers. Those people, their house is no longer worth $3 million. It's worth less than that.
So Ross,
out of the tax.
Yes. So Ross, did the BC government really have to put a 20% foreign buyer tax on property, special tax on homes over $3 million in assessed value, a special tax on recreational property, a special tax on if you owned a second property, whether it was for recreational or investment purposes? Is this akin to, we knew prices would come down on their own because that's what high prices do. They force them down. I say it's like a baby just fell out of the window, and while it's laying there on the sidewalk, you've come along with a shovel and beat it on the face. Isn't that pretty well what all these extra taxes in a falling market have done? And isn't it now time to, stop this manipulation of the market, which they're attempting? Because the market's already made the adjustment. Why make it worse?
Well, what they need to do is they have to accept that they don't understand what they're doing. They have to accept when they put the foreign buyer tax in July of 2016, the housing market was already negative that spring. That market peaked in March. They brought these rules in months later. So the correcting market was not a consequence of that. All it did is it made it happen quicker than it normally happens, and it was harder in certain categories of homes. I am a firm believer that if you are not a Canadian, you should not own a Canadian home. I am a firm believer in that. If they want to make some kind of an exception for economic reasons, that the odd foreign buyer can buy the odd Canadian home, I have no problem with that. But I believe all Canadian homes should first be occupied by Canadians. Now, you do that by instituting fair taxation policy, not by throwing on tax policy that doesn't make any sense. What do I mean by that really? What I mean by that is this. Vancouver property taxes are the lowest in the country. If I own a $1 million home in Vancouver, I pay around $2,600 a year property tax. If I own that house in Calgary, I'm paying about $8,500, an extra $6,000. So it's a property tax issue that is the problem. Now, people say, oh, well, houses are more expensive here. That's irrelevant. It isn't it. You still have to treat your home as an investment as well as a place to live. It needs to be taxed properly that way. Okay, we don't want to have property taxes go up and kick people out of their homes who can't afford to pay the property taxes. Well, you have a tax offset in Vancouver and British Columbia. What you need is the land itself can no longer be a commodity. You cannot allow builders or developers in Greater Vancouver to treat land as a stock. You need to force them to treat land as a place to build upon to make profits. Not the profit in the land itself, but in the buildings or homes that you create. And I'm a believer in this. Any place where the government limits the number of new building lots that can be developed. Any place in Canada where a local government or a provincial government or a federal government limits the number of backyards that can be created in a community, the land must be treated not as an asset. You want the builders who build the homes to profit from constructing the home. You don't want the developer, the land speculator, the mortgage financing company to profit by causing lots to be traded over and over again, inflating the value when there is no value added coming into the economy. When a builder builds a house, when a builder physically builds the house, and they extract a fair profit margin from that house, and that can be flexible. In good times, maybe it's 30%. In bad times, maybe it's 20%. That is money that's going directly into the community. It's in people that are being employed directly in the community. It is improving the housing stock in the community. It is making society a functional place for us to grow. When a land developer takes a property and flips it, they flip it by upzoning it over and over and over again. Each upzoning, the price of the land increases. So that the footprint that a house is going to occupy on that land is going to be decreasing. I mean, there are some buildings in Canada today, high-rises, where the house itself actually occupies less than 1 square foot of land. Obviously, that land is thus more expensive. So what the province, what the municipalities, what the federal government needs to do is they need to limit the profits that can be made by flipping land through upzoning. That's all that they had it to do right from day one. That way, if a foreign investor, which bought land in Vancouver, flipped it 4 or 5 times, increasing the value, what they're selling it for each time, upzoning it in the process. Now we've got to upzone it so we can build more affordable homes. Hogwash. There's no reason that land increases in value because the government or the municipality says we're going to upzone it. No. If they want to do it that way, okay, if we upzone your land, you are going to have to retroactively pay back taxes for the last 25 years, which wipes out any of the profit that you would have made, which makes the effective sale of the land neutral. We want the profits to be made on the construction of the homes, not on the flipping of the land. And this is where the problem, Jim, that you have today across the larger CMAs in this country. You don't have proactive land development limitations placed on your building envelopes. And that's what needs to take place. So, they're sitting there laughing at the housing prices falling. They're proud of the housing prices falling. They're proud that those young couples in 2017 who used a $37,000 first-time buyer incentive in British Columbia have lost money on their houses. They're proud of that. What I would be proud of would have been to put in policies that were effective, that would have mitigated the damage, increased the number of homes available for people entering the housing market, and at the same time, I also would have made post-secondary institutions in the province accountable for housing their own student population. That's what Carol James should be bragging about. We have made these changes to the development infrastructure in the Greater Vancouver area that is going to limit profits being made to the construction of new homes. It isn't going to be artificially inflating value so some stakeholder can take out profits that they never, ever earn.
We'll have more with Ross Kay right after this.
Cypress Development Corp. is developing a world-class lithium resource in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. The size of the resource makes the Clayton Valley project a premier asset with the potential to impact the future of lithium supply. Cypress Development Corp. trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the OTCQB, symbol CYDVF, and on Frankfurt, symbol C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon, trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Ross Kay. Ross, a phenomena here in the Vancouver area is you might be a small business in a 1 or 2 story building, but it's zoned so you can build a 55-story high-rise, and that's the property tax they have to pay. It's not on their 2-story building, it's on the potential of a 55-story building. Is that done anywhere else in Canada?
It's not done anywhere else in Canada, and it's really not done there either. Now, it's done there if the upzoning has already taken place. So, either the current owner applied for the upzoning, Jim, or they purchased it already knowing that the upzoning was going to take place. There is not in the history of Canada an area where land magically increased in value. We have unlimited growth potential in this country, whether it is the Greater Vancouver area or the Greater Toronto area or the Greater Montreal area. We only have to extend our boundaries by 1% on the outer perimeter of of these CMAs, and you can effectively increase your housing stock by 25%. When I look at Vancouver, we're looking at where can we add housing stock in Vancouver without negatively impacting anyone. In other words, the people who have owned a single detached home for the last 40 years really don't want a high-rise or even a 4 or 5-story building to go into their neighborhood. I respect both sides of that argument. I respect the families don't want the community to change. I respect other people who are looking for homes. They can't find a home, and they believe that if you add a 4 or 5 story building into a neighborhood, that's going to give them an opportunity to get in there. Those are not solutions. We don't view those as solutions, Jim. We see those as confrontations that create a division in your society, in your city, to create major problems. It's the same as trying to use someone's last name to determine a racial profile of a foreign buyer in Vancouver instead of simply saying foreign buyers, period. We don't care where they're from. They're non-Canadians. When it comes to, we'll go back specifically to Vancouver. If you just simply take the perimeter of the endowment lands as it abuts to the city lands, if you only take about 2% along those abutting lines, and on those 2%, you build high-rise towers of affordable housing, they're effectively going to back onto the endowment lands. So if anyone's looked at Central Park in New York, you would see what it looks like to have high-rise apartments backing onto green space. That's exactly what we would recommend goes on in Vancouver. We would also go further to say any golf course that exists in Vancouver, those golf courses are developed. And if you want to golf, you have to go further outside of the city. Because we can't afford to have a couple hundred people occupying golfing in a place where we could have 300 or 400 townhomes. We would also say that there are many parks in Vancouver where, again, if you simply just added to the perimeter high-rise or medium-density housing that backs onto the park and abuts existing residential areas, you have a simple solution to what's going on. But we don't hear any of this, Jim. We don't hear any rational thought about how are we going to improve the number of houses that we have without destroying the lives of other people. And I can tell you, Jim, this NIMBYism talk that has predominated the conversation the last 5 or 6 years, people really are emotionally involved in not wanting their neighborhoods to change. Now, some of that's bad, some of that's good, but they are emotionally involved. And it is a responsibility of the politicians to respect the voters' intent. So you need to find solutions that are going to cause the least amount of damage. If you have upzoned the land, and the price of the land now, the value of that land, in other words, you could sell it for this price because it's been upzoned so much. Yes, you should pay property taxes on that land. That should be the same way everywhere in Canada. I personally believe, watching the development process and being involved in it for 3 decades, is that when land is upzoned, there should be some kind of a remuneration paid to the city, which the city can then abate to the new homeowners that are going to be occupying that space. So we're just basically keep going around and around and around in a circle here. This is simply governments who do not understand how the housing market works, how you must grow your housing stock in harmony with the existing stock, with the existing base of homeowners, with the existing base of tenants. I mean, there are people who are going to want to be tenants their entire life. They have made that choice. But the vast majority of Canadians, over 70%, want to own a home. If that means when land is upzoned, property taxes are payable on the upzoned value, I'm 100% for that.
Ross, a 32-year-old listener from Vaughan, Ontario asked, should I be looking to buy a single detached in Richmond Hill or Vaughan? Now prices have drastically fallen, and maybe explain to people who may not be familiar with Richmond Hill or Vaughan.
Okay, so Richmond Hill and Vaughan is in Ontario, and it's just it's the north part of the city of Toronto. So when you're looking in Vancouver, this would be like Port Coquitlam, Surrey. If you're looking in, you can't really say Calgary because you'd have to go all the way up to Edmonton, and Edmonton would have to come all the way down to Calgary. You could look in Quebec. So if you look at the islands, that would be it. So there's really only three major urban areas in Canada that are like this. So what I'm saying, what I mean when I'm by saying that, Jim, is that people can choose to move a few kilometers apart and be in a totally different city if they're able to commute. They have choice. So whether it's transit or by car, it gives them life choices. So that really comes into play in this example that you gave me here today. What I would say to this young couple, you said they're 32, I think. Look, I can move you 0.5 kilometers, 1/2 of a kilometer in the GTA. You can live in the exact same home. Your kids can go to the exact same schools. Your commute to work will be exactly the same. The home you are buying, identical. The price that you pay for the home is identical. The house will be the same age, identical. 1/2 a kilometer apart. And I can tell you that you can buy a home in one area where you're going to see a 30% increase in wealth higher than a location 1/2 a kilometer away. We can do this virtually anywhere in Canada today because we look at the entire cost of ownership and the expense of ownership. They're not the same. They're two things. They're part of a whole. People pay a shelter expense to live. Now, if you're there's like these minimum wage survey that was done last week that made the headlines across Canada about people not being able to afford a one-bedroom apartment, a minimum wage, virtually anywhere in Canada. And we said hogwash. We can go on to MLS on the Realtor.ca website today, and we can go across this country, and we can find homes in most of the cities they said you couldn't afford to rent to actually own if you just made minimum wage. Now, that's not saying that it's going to happen in Vancouver or in downtown Toronto. Okay? Your shelter expense in those two cities is going to be substantially higher. And then if you want to own a home, the added cost of owning will be even higher. The survey that said about minimum wage. Okay, first of all, let's not talk about an individual. An individual who is earning minimum wage is probably not going to rent a one-bedroom apartment. They probably never did. They're probably going to room with somebody else, a buddy, a friend, family member, and the two of them will share a residence somewhere. Their shelter cost is effectively dropped to around 60% if they go alone. Not 50%, but it's about 60% versus going it alone. So this study is just fueling a false narrative, which it sounds like the young couple you're asking me, this would be another situation. The false narrative that allows real estate brokers to sell houses across Canada equally, no matter what city you're living in, is what the problem is here. Because if I told you the Richmond Hill and Vaughan family, who instead moves to Brampton and simply and buying $1 million home, Jim. Okay? So you can move half a kilometer from Richmond Hill into Brampton, Vaughan into Brampton, by spending $1 million, but by moving to Brampton, you're going to be 30% wealthier 30 years from now. And people say, well, Ross, how does that happen? Well, it happens because you're paying lower property tax on your $1 million home in Brampton. And if you simply took the tax savings that you would have paid in Richmond Hill or Vaughan, and you put it in your TFSA, and you give it to a financial advisor who gets you a 6% compound annual growth rate, you're going to be $300,000 richer after 30 years. Do the math. If it's a decision between Vancouver and Hamilton, so Vancouver, $1 million, Hamilton, $1 million, I'm buying Vancouver because I'm saving $8,000 a year in property taxes. I am saving more money in property taxes by buying $1 million house in Vancouver than I can put in my TFSA. I can't even fill my TFSA. I'm going to overflow my TFSA. I'm going to have to use my RRSP because of property tax savings. Now, let's not stop there. Let's look at the family who's looking at two seemingly identical homes. One's 10 years older than the other. Look identical. Well, the cost of owning that 10-year-old home is going to be substantially higher than the cost of the one that's not 10 years old, because there are already things that are worn out in the property that need to be replaced. So you need to calculate that as a cost. Your shelter expense is not going to change. We look at shelter expense this way, Jim. If you are renting a house, that is your shelter expense. So if you are renting a house, whether you own it or not, the only difference is who the landlord is. If you're renting a house that you own, then you're both the landlord and the tenant. If you're renting a house that someone else owns, then you're the tenant and they're the landlord. Your shelter expense is going to be the same, and then there's going to be an ownership cost. By minimizing your ownership cost, by proactively approaching it, of reducing your ownership costs, by A, choosing where you buy the home, B, what home you choose to buy, C, what type of a mortgage financing you're going to use, D, what kind of a down payment are you going to be entering the market with, your insurance costs, your landscaping costs, your property tax profile over the next 20 years. Because if I'm in an area where property taxes are rising, at the same time I'm already paying a higher property tax, it's going to get worse every year that I go along. If I'm in Vancouver, where politicians don't clue into this, my cost gets lower every year. Now, it's going to go up this year because property values dropped. But between 2008 and 2017 in Vancouver, my property taxes dropped on the exact same $1 million investment. So, this couple in Vaughan, Richmond Hill, what I would say is this answer. Every single home buying decision in this country is unique. No two are identical. There are literally dozens of factors that influence each couple, even if they move from one side of the street to the other in a house that seems to be the same, paying the exact same amount of money. There is a world of difference between each individual home buyer in Canada. The questions that home buyers need to be asked are nothing that appear in the manuals written by CMHC, the banks, or the realtors. Because all those manuals do is direct you to buying a house anywhere, under any conditions, as long as the price is okay and you qualify. You need to be looking at your 30, 40, and 50-year financial outcome of owning the home. If you don't do that, you're never going to consider moving half a kilometer away and being $300,000 richer 30 years from now. And I want your listeners to think about this. When we talk about house price gains over a long period of time, you talk about the performance of housing prices versus the stock market. If you can move somewhere in your house and you are going to be 30% wealthier 30 years from now, the return that the financially inferior home is going to have to return is impossible. That home will not escalate in value enough to offset the return that lowering your cost of ownership makes. You need to sit down and go over these things in a rational, fact-based decision-making process where that you can clearly see if we stay in Richmond Hill or Vaughan, we're going to be $300,000 poorer than if we moved to Brampton. Now, you can imagine the uproar that would happen in this country if people realized it makes so much sense to buy a home in Vancouver versus Langley because you're saving so much in property tax. You can imagine the price pressure in low property tax environments. The reason we're in this problem is because the property tax assessment system was flawed from the day it was launched. It has created huge wealth-building opportunities in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, which are not available to people who move out into the suburbs where they pay higher taxes. It is a mythical feature, market value assessment, created by economists and academics who did not forecast what happens when housing prices and the housing stock changes over time. Vaughan, Richmond Hill, move half a kilometer, guys. Get into that Brampton designated municipality and take the tax savings you're going to make each year and invest it in your TFSA. Call one of these real smart guys out there that know what they're doing with these TFSA investments and say, look, I want a no-risk 30-year. I'm going to put my money there and leave it. I know what I'd be doing today, folks. I'd be buying CIBC stock because it's paying over 5% on a dividend. And since I'm not going to sell it for 30 years, I don't care if it drops 50% tomorrow. All I care about is the dividend because the dividend will always be there. So that would be my answer to those folks, Jim.
We'll have more with Ross Kay right after this.
Grand Portage Resources' Herbert Gold Project in southeast Alaska highlights increased gold resource, indicated and inferred, of 860,000 ounces, in excess of 10 grams per ton gold. Expansion drilling is planned on the Herbert Gold property for the summer of 2019. Grand Portage Resources trading symbols are GPG on the TSX Venture, GPTRF on the OTCQB, and GPB on Frankfurt. For more information, please visit our website, grandportage.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Ross Kay. Ross, many housing analysts have written books and made forecasts about housing bubbles and often take heat for missing the timing on their calls. Why are housing bears seemingly always waiting on the bubble popping instead of predicting when it will happen?
Great question. Okay. I read something about this on the weekend. So there are a lot of people who forecast housing bubbles and them breaking, and they're always wrong. Now, they're wrong, or they appear to be wrong. They're actually right. It's just they appear to be wrong. They appear to be wrong because the home trading infrastructure changes as a housing market moves forward. So they're predicting a housing bubble. They're right. You're in a housing bubble. And they're saying it's going to break. And then you wonder, 5 years later, wow, this thing's never going to break. Oh, wow, I shouldn't have listened to this guy. 5 years ago, I should have done this. Well, what you don't understand is that every single time a teeny tiny change to the home trading infrastructure takes place, you have to readjust when the housing bubble is going to break. And government and banks and realtors, I believe the entire global economy does not want a housing bubble to break. So there are changes that take place that extend the length of time before the bubble breaks. So let's look at Canada. Okay, in the fall of summer of 2013, the Canadian housing market was moving to a correction. This is a black and white issue. When we sit there and look at the data, we have it on a chart. It is a black and white issue. All the metrics we're recording, we are moving into a correction. So the Canadian housing market in 2013 was moving into a correction. What happened that fall? Interest rates dropped. Shockingly, interest rates dropped. The banks, in turn, played interest rate games. That spurred on a little bit of added activity that allowed the realtors to say, oh, the housing market's got hotter. Fear of missing out started to come into play. Which each successive slowdown in the housing market between the summer of 2013 and the spring of 2016, there was a change to the home trading infrastructure. Either legislation changes, interest rate changes, economic changes to the earning power of Canadians, immigration changes. All of those changes took place, which simply delayed the deflation of the housing bubble. You can't expect a housing bear. Now, I don't believe in this bear and bull myth anyways in the housing market. It's either the housing market's going to inflate or it's going to deflate, one or the other. You can't blame these people for being inaccurate in their forecasts. They were right. What they didn't say is, okay, every time there's a change, I'm going to have to adjust my forecast. Well, why don't they say that? Well, because people, oh yeah, you're just making it up. So now that didn't work out the way you said it is, now you're going to say it's going to happen later, so you're making this up as you go. No. Those housing analysts were correct. Those housing analysts just don't understand how you read a housing market. That's all. They were forecasting change that eventually would happen. The change that they're recording just simply is happening at a different time because while they were waiting for their forecast to come true, changes took place to the home trading infrastructure. And some of these changes are minor. Some of them are major. Some of them have intended consequences. Some of them have unintended consequences. What I would say is when you're looking at all the data, the consequences are all black and white. They're all fully laid out. These people who are predicting housing bubbles and saying that they were going to pop, they were actually right. They just weren't adjusting for each change that was brought into the market to delay the pop from happening. We're seeing it right now, Jim. The American government is going to lower their Fed rate. So everybody can laugh at Trump all you want. Okay, like I've always said, he's not a guy I'd ever want my daughter to date. Well, my daughter would punch him, but that's besides the point. But he understands that if you are not dropping interest rates in the United States, your housing market is going to tank. He understands that. I believe that in Canada, there's a bit of they don't recognize that. But you know something? Before Trump was in power, I don't think the Americans recognized it either. He's the only president to come out and attack the Fed and say, you've got to lower rates. Why? Because I don't want I don't want the economy to stall. Well, that's happening in Canada today. Our economy, as far as we record it, is already in a recession. So the way that we record things, it's already in a recession. Now, we only look at a couple of aspects of the economy that we're qualified to comment on. Residential construction. Well, you heard the stories today. Residential construction. Multifamily sales are increasing. Well, we don't care about multifamily sales because we know single-family sales are down by 30% off peak. So new construction from single families is down 30%. I don't care if the multifamily's up. The multifamily is simply filling in for the single family that's no longer being built. How come they didn't talk about that today? You know, we hear about all of the building that's going on. You know, the condo high rises in Toronto, in Vancouver. Look at folks. When you don't build single detached houses in your suburbs, that means you're going to build high rises in your prime real estate markets. That's what's going on right now. If you look at the overall housing market, residential housing market, the way we calculate them, you have less real estate investment. It's been negative for over a year and a half. If you calculate real estate as a percentage of GDP the way that we calculate, it's negative. And it is so negative that when you accommodate the current GDP numbers, just assuming that what we're saying is correct, just assume that real estate commissions with sales down like by 10% really are down 10%. They haven't gone up the way that StatsCan reports it as an increase. Those numbers have really gone down. And when you take those numbers out, it's a recession. And it possibly is a recession going all the way back till March of 2017. Because when you remove the housing influence on gross domestic product, the way that we calculate it, those are negative numbers. So in a nutshell, Jim, the Bears were right. They simply weren't adjusting their forecasts to people that were trying to prove them wrong.
Ross, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Jim.
If you have any questions for Ross, you can send them to info@housestreet.com. My guest has been Ross Kay from the wealthyhomeowner.ca. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of House Street Media Incorporated.